He called Chuck Norris's men a fraud on a global stage, but what Chuck did next wasn't a speech. It was a lesson written in silence, sweat, and bone. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The Seoul World Martial Arts Expo wasn't just an event, it was a pilgrimage. Inside the massive dome convention hall, legends walked shoulder to shoulder with young hopefuls, and every dojo banner fluttered like a battle flag from every corner of the globe. Under 1,000 spotlights, the main stage gleamed, a polished square mat circled by lights and press cameras, all angled at the man holding the microphone. Gene Q, a name that struck either awe or irritation, depending on whom you ask, Taekwondo prodigy, 5-time international champion, South Korea's golden fist, and unapologetically arrogant. He stood center stage in a spotless dobok, the black belt around his waist high with surgical precision. His presence was magnetic and cruel, like a smile hiding a switchblade. He raised the mic, eyes scanning to see his spectators, challengers, coaches, and journalists. The crowd settled. The cameras zoomed in. "Let's be honest," Gene began, his voice smooth, sharp, unblinking. "Every year we gather to honor warriors, real warriors, fighters who stepped into rings, who bled for their art, not actors, not illusionists." There was a chuckle, nervous, scattered. "In fact," he said, tilting his head toward the audience, "it's time we stop confusing choreography with combat." A few heads turned. The audience murmured. Gene let the silence simmer, then dropped the hammer. "I've seen the tapes. David Morgan, the so-called master behind half the Hollywood fight scenes, the man who trained Chuck Norris." He gave the word trained air quotes. "Please." Laughter, this time louder. The insult had landed. David taught fake punches. He was good with camera angles, and Hollywood, of course, called him a legend. Gene sneered, but he was just another stunt supervisor with a whistle. In the front row, Chuck Norris sat perfectly still, cowboy boots flat on the floor, hands folded in his lap, black jacket zipped up to the collar. His eyes didn't flinch, his jaw didn't clench. But those who knew him, they would have noticed the smallest shift. The breath that paused for half a second longer, the stare that no longer blinked. Gene wasn't done. He grinned wider now, feeding off the tension. "Tell me, does teaching actors how to pretend to get hit make someone a master?" He leaned forward, voice dipped in venom. "Because if so, I guess every Hollywood stuntman is now a tent Dan." A ripple spread across the audience. Whispers, uneasy glances toward the front row, toward the man who still hadn't moved. Chuck's expression was unreadable like carved granite. But the silence was no longer neutral. It was charged, and Gene could feel it. So he went further. "David Morgan never stepped into a ring with killers," Gene said. His tone now a low growl. He taught illusion, not survival. The moderator shifted awkwardly in his seat. One of the interpreters paused, then hesitated to continue. The insult had crossed the line, translated or not. It was clear in every language. But Gene wasn't finished. He scanned the room again, as if daring anyone to stop him. Then he locked eyes on Chuck and smiled. "If his ghost is watching," Gene said, slow and deliberate, "tell him come shut me up." The room froze. Every breath caught. Even the LED lights above seemed to dim for a second. A woman in the press pit lowered her camera. A child seated behind the third row clutched his father's sleeve. Somewhere near the back, a grandmaster muttered something in Korean and shook his head. Chuck didn't move, but the silence around him did. It shifted, like the air before a thunderstorm. Every instinct in the room sensed it. This wasn't just tension anymore. This was a provocation, and something was about to break. The silence held. A kind of silence that didn't ask for attention. It demanded it. The kind that made people forget to breathe. Gene Q stood relaxed, eyes glittering under the overhead lights, pleased with the unease he created. Around him, the massive hall felt smaller somehow, tighter, like the air itself was afraid to move. Chuck Norris still hadn't shifted in his seat, still staring forward, still unmoved. But it was clear now he was ignoring Gene. He was measuring him. The moderator tried to regain control. Well, that's certainly a perspective. He chuckled nervously. Let's pivot the discussion a bit. Master Gene, you've had strong opinions on traditional forms. But Gene raised a hand, cutting him off without even looking. I'm not finished. The moderator froze, caught between diplomacy and dread. Gene's voice dropped an octave, quieter now. That made it worse. Every word felt heavier. I didn't come here to trade handshakes with movie stars, he said. I came here to remind people what real martial arts look like. He started pacing slowly, letting the mic dangle in one hand like a predator circling a cage. I grew up watching the old tapes. You all remember them. Grainy VHS reels, men in bandanas, throwing high kicks in slow motion. Action heroes, they called them. He stopped pacing, turned back to the audience. Action heroes. Another pause, another smirk. But when I finally met David Morgan at a seminar in LA, he didn't even throw a punch. He just watched, gave notes, told me my camera presence needed polish. A bitter chuckle. He was training for film, not for war. Some in the audience looked down, others exchanged glances. Many weren't laughing anymore. Gene wasn't trying to be funny. He was trying to erase a man's legacy. In the ring, David Morgan wouldn't have lasted 30 seconds. He didn't teach warriors. He taught actors how to fall. The camera crew started to pull back their lenses, no longer looking for reaction shots, just trying to document what felt like a moment spiraling out of control. Gene raised the mic again, and yet today, we let a student sit in the front row at expos like this. We call them masters. We clap for them like they've survived the grind, the grit, the sacrifice. He paused, then looked straight at Chuck. But they haven't. That did it. The murmur swelled, not because it was louder, but because it was aimed, specific, direct, no longer about David Morgan. This was about Chuck now. A camera flash went off. Then another. A teenage black belt in the second row gasped and whispered, he's going to say his name. Gene said his name, Chuck Norris. He didn't say it with reverence. He said it was like a challenge. You were the poster boy, weren't you? Gene said, cowboy hats, roundhouse kicks, studio lighting. Your mentor made you look untouchable. Chuck finally looked up, not at Gene, at no one in particular. Just a slow lift of the eyes, almost like a reset. Gene didn't notice, or maybe he didn't care. But tell me, Gene continued pacing again, when was the last time you bled in silence? When was the last time you stepped into a ring without a stunt coordinator? He raised his voice. Because I have 5 countries, 7 titles, no retakes, no padding. Gene stopped. Mike raised like a dagger. I don't care who you train with. Your belts don't impress me. Your mentor doesn't impress me. In fact, he leaned forward. If David Morgan meant so much to you, he pointed toward Chuck now. Arm extended, then defended him. A stun hush. Chuck didn't blink, didn't move. Not yet. Gene twisted the knife, or sit back down with the rest of the audience and admit what we all know. His voice sharpened. You're just another actor wearing someone else's black belt. No one moved. Even the moderators looked frozen. The camera crews didn't dare speak. All you could hear were the faint words of lenses adjusting and a single cough from the far left aisle. Chuck's face was unreadable. Stone. Then Gene stepped forward. One last line. One last strike. He lowered the mic just enough that the words weren't amplified, just loud enough to be picked up by every boom mic in the room. Tell your ghost, he whispered, to make me stop. For a second, even time seemed to hesitate. Then, Chuck stood, not suddenly, not dramatically, just inevitably, like a stone finally shifting after centuries in place. The room's air collapsed inward. A few audience members stood instinctively. Phones rose. One journalist accidentally dropped their notepad with a soft slap against the floor, but didn't move to pick it up. Jean blinked. Chuck walked forward, boots heavy, deliberate, not toward the stage, but toward the center mat. That quiet square of open floor meant for demonstration matches, not drama, not for this. But now, it was becoming something else. Jean tilted his head, watching. "Oh," he said, smirking. "Did I touch a nerve?" Chuck reached the edge of the mat, stopped. His voice, when it came, didn't need a mic. It cut through the air like a blade. "Say what you want about me." His eyes met Jean's. "But David Morgan taught more honor in one breath than you've shown in your entire career." Gasps. Jean rolled his shoulders back, waving him off. "Then defend him, cowboy." Chuck stepped onto the mat, boots meeting canvas with a thud that felt biblical. "I will," he said, voice low, "even if he's not here to see it." The mat zone had no spotlight, but all eyes were on it. Chuck Norris stood at its center, alone. No gloves, no camera crew, no showman's flair. Just a man in worn boots and a black zip-up jacket. His hands relaxed at his sides, shoulders still. There was no announcement, no bell. But the moment he stepped forward, something shifted. The expo was no longer a celebration. It was a reckoning. Jean Q remained at the stage edge, watching him with the smugness of a man who still believed he was in control. He turned toward the moderator with a performative shrug. "Well, it looks like the cowboy wants a demonstration," he said, loud enough to draw chuckles from a few unsure spectators. The moderator looked pale. He reached for the mic, then stopped himself. There was no point. This wasn't a panel anymore. Jean hopped down from the stage with a soft thump, landing just outside the LED-lit border of the open mat. As he approached, he rolled his shoulders, letting out an exaggerated sigh, like a man preparing for a sparring match he didn't really want, but would tolerate for the cameras. But there were no cameras. Not officially. Only the phones are now recording silently, rising one by one like stars in the darkness. Jean crossed the threshold and stepped into the mat zone. His posture was loose, bouncing lightly on the balls of his feet. "Let's see what old-school Texas has left in the tank," he smirked. Chuck said nothing. Jean bowed, barely, just enough to pass as respectful. Chuck didn't return the bow. He just lowered his chin slightly, eyes locked forward, feet shoulder-width apart. No stance, no tension, just centered. A storm waiting to be asked for. Jean began to circle him. "I'll be gentle," he said with a wink. "Wouldn't want to break anything vital." He launched the first strike without warning, a sharp front kick, fast and clean, snapping toward Chuck's midsection. Chuck didn't flinch. His left hand slid across, absorbing the strike on his forearm, body shifting just enough to let the impact bleed off into the mat. He didn't move his feet. Didn't strike back, just adjusted. Jean bounced backward and laughed. "All right," he said. "You're not made of glass." He came again, this time a spinning roundhouse, high and theatrical, the kind that ends matches and highlights reels. Chuck ducked, clean and efficient. The kick passed over his shoulder like a gust of wind, still no retaliation. Jean landed, frowned. "Come on, cowboy," he said, louder this time. "You're not just here to be a scarecrow, are you?" Chuck's eyes never left his. "You're wasting movement," Chuck said. It was the first time his voice had been heard on the mat. Jean blinked, stunned for half a beat, then grinned wide. "Wasting movement," he repeated mockingly. "That's what David taught you, efficiency and silence." He came forward in a flurry, 3 rapid kicks, low, middle, high. Chuck blocked the first two. The third clipped his cheekbone. A thin red line opened beneath his left eye. The crowd gasped. A few phones zoomed in, pixels tightening on the first mark drawn. Gene danced back, spreading his arms theatrically. "There it is," he called out. "The first real contact in Chuck Norris's history." He clapped mockingly. One or two hesitant laughs followed, but they died quickly. Chuck didn't move. He blinked once, letting the blood trail down his cheek like rain off a statue. No rage, no pain, only breath. Calm, deliberate, watching, waiting. Gene lowered his arms, his showman grin twitching at the edges. "Come on, movie man," he said, voice low now. "Give them something to cheer for." Chuck stilled in advance. He just adjusted his footing. One subtle shift, the kind that only real fighters noticed. And in the second row, an older Muay Thai master leaned toward his student and whispered, "He's not losing."
After as the step Showdown said, then yes, Kisiki, or even then says, but he got kisses. Exactly, say, there's that I
Low toward Chuck's thigh. It landed with a thud, solid contact. Gene smirked, encouraged. He launched a second one, harder. Same spot. Chuck absorbed it. No recoil, just a slight bend in the knee. Then came the third. But this time, Chuck moved, not backward, forward. His rear leg swept in, chopping through the space between them with surgical speed. A low kick, precise, bone first, slammed into Gene's lead thigh, right on the femoral nerve. The sound cracked like a branch snapping in. Winter. Gene's leg buckled half an inch. A gasp rippled through the audience like wind across tall grass. Gene staggered, blinking fast, foot dragging half a beat late. He tried to bounce again, but it wasn't there. The spring in his step had vanished. He threw a wild jab to recover ground. Chuck slipped it, stepped inside, and then came the hook. Short, tight, mechanical. Chuck's right hand launched from his hip and drove into Gene's ribs with piston force. Gene grunted, body folding slightly at the impact. The air left him in a sudden cough. The crowd was dead silent. No applause, no shouting. Just realization. Gene took 2 stutter steps backward, shaking out his arms like it was all part of the plan. "Lucky shot," he muttered, though his voice cracked. Sweat had started to bead at his temples. Chuck didn't chase. He didn't posture. He stood still, eyes locked, chest rising in steady rhythm. Gene rushed. Desperation seeped into his form. He spun into a high kick, flashy, reckless, loaded with ego. But Chuck had already pivoted low. He ducked under the arc, stepped in close, and caught the leg mid-spin, hooking Gene's thigh over his forearm. Time slowed. Chuck didn't roar. He didn't smirk. He just shifted his hips and drove forward like a wave crashing down. Gene went airborne and hit the mat flat on his back with a brutal thud. No grace, no choreography, just force, precision, and gravity. The crowd didn't cheer. They exhaled. Chuck stepped back, giving Gene space. Gene lay there, stunned, staring up at the lights. He blinked once, then twice. The swagger was gone. The grin had fled. He tried to sit up but winced as his ribs protested. Chuck's voice came quiet and cool. "David taught me that too." That was the moment it shifted. Not the impact, not the throw. The realization. This wasn't a movie. This wasn't an actor. This was a man who had learned very real lessons from a man the world had forgotten. Gene Q sat on the mat, palms pressed against the canvas, chest heaving. His eyes were wide, but not from pain, from disbelief. The silence stretched across the arena like a sheet of glass. Only the hum of ventilation filled the space above the stunned audience. The lights hadn't dimmed, but somehow everything felt darker. He had just been dumped, hard, in front of every fighter, master, and camera in the building. And the man who did it was already stepping back, giving him room. Chuck Norris didn't advance, didn't gloat. He stood still, posture neutral, as if the throw hadn't meant anything. That's what made it worse. Gene pushed himself upright, jaw clenched, limbs shaky. He forced his breath into rhythm, trying to avert the humiliation boiling under his skin. He had fought in 5 continents, held world titles, given interviews in 3 languages, but right now, his body was betraying him. And Chuck looked like a man standing in line for coffee. Gene's ego screamed. He needed to erase that moment. Now, with a snarl, he lunged forward. He came in with a fast back fist into a high round kick, then feinted low, attempting a spinning hook to catch Chuck off guard. The kind of sequence that made highlight reels. The kind of chaos no one could read. But Chuck didn't need to read it. He cut through it. He stepped into the middle of Gene's spin, catching the incoming leg with one arm, slipping under the second rotation. With the other hand, he grabbed Gene's belt, not at the waist, but low, near the hip seam, and pivoted his body with brutal clarity. Sweep, turn, drive. Gene's other leg lost traction, and down he went. Again. This time not flat. This time sideways, his hips slamming into the floor as his upper body twisted awkwardly behind him. He grunted, pain blooming across his shoulder. The crowd winced. A Thai kickboxing coach in the 5th row whispered that was an inside hook sweep from someone who's not real. Chuck backed away. Again. No theatrics, no victory pose, just room. Gene groaned, rolled all 4s. He tried to rise. He didn't see the next move coming. Chuck was already moving. Quiet. Efficient. He reached down, hooked 2 fingers into the back of Gene's doba collar, lifted just enough to unbalance him, then squeezed his own body with a twist of the hips and crack. The elbow came from below. Clean. Perfectly placed. Right into Gene's jaw. The sound echoed across the mat like a gunshot. Gene went limp, not unconscious, just disconnected. His limbs collapsed inward. His knees gave out. His mouth hung open. Lip already splitting, blood darkening. His teeth, he folded, dropped like a sack of laundry. The audience didn't react. They were too stunned. Some had forgotten to record. Others simply held their phones at chest level, mouths open, paralyzed. Chuck stood over Gene for a moment, breathing just a bit heavier now. Not with strain, but with finality. He looked down at the broken man. Beneath him, not with contempt, with disappointment. Then finally he spoke. Quiet, level, final. David taught me how to end fights. I never wanted to start them. He turned away. The mat, still lit by soft LEDs, now looked more like a stage than had just witnessed a tragedy. Gene lay in the center, belt loosened, dobok collar twisted, blood slowly trailing from his lip to the floor. Chuck walked to the edge, bent down, picked up his hoodie, folded neatly where he'd left it. He slipped it on. No bow, no waves, no look back. Just a man finishing something that should never have needed starting. An expo staffer rushed in, kneeling beside Gene, checking his pulse, calling for a medic. The MC hovered awkwardly at the edge of the stage, mic trembling in his hand, unsure whether to speak at all. No one clapped. No one cheered. Because this wasn't a show. This was a correction. And the man who delivered it was already walking down the corridor behind the stage, leaving behind only silence and the memory of a lesson long overdue. Gene Q blinked slowly, his vision clouded by the sweat and blood sliding down his face. He could feel the mat under his cheek, cool and unmoving. He heard voices, distant, distorted. The lights above blurred into twin halos. His jaw throbbed. His ears rang. He didn't know how long he had been down, but when he pushed himself up, painfully, awkwardly, Chuck Norris was still there, still standing, still waiting, still calm, not hovering, not advancing, just there like gravity, an inevitability. Gene managed to get to one knee, then force himself upright with a hiss of breath. The medic tried to step in, but Gene brushed him off with a shaky hand. He wasn't done. Not yet. Not like this. Not on the floor. Not in front of everyone. He bounced, lightly on the balls of his feet, just like always. But it was an illusion. His footing was uneven, his stance had lost its depth. His eyes darted instead of locking, and the blood at the corner of his mouth made it hard to speak without tasting. Failure. Chuck still hadn't moved. The silence in the arena felt heavier now. There were no whispers anymore, only watching, processing, waiting, and Gene could feel it. The shift. The crowd no longer expected him to win. Now, they were just waiting to see how he'd lose. His pride boiled. He clenched his fists, gritted his teeth and let out a short bark, half fury, half self-encouragement. Then he lunged. A flurry. Back fist. High kick. Feigned low sweep into a spinning hook, a desperate attempt at rhythm. Something that looked like control. Something that could steal the narrative back. But Chuck didn't chase it. He didn't try to block everything. He just watched. Moved, slipped, shifted angles like water around rocks. Then he stepped in, cutting through the chaos like a scalpel. Gene's leg lifted for a side kick and Chuck was already inside the arc. One hand deflected the chambering thigh, the other shot forward and grabbed the knot of Gene's belt at the hip. And then, with a fluid twist of the waist and a sharp pivot of his right foot, Chuck swept out Gene's supporting leg with a brutal inside hook kick. Gene's body lifted, weightless for a breath, then slammed onto mat with a thud that echoed in ribs and reputation alike. A groan escaped him. One leg flailed. His hands searched for balance. His dobok had twisted halfway around his torso. His black belt had loosened, one end trailing across the canvas like a forgotten ribbon. Chuck stepped back again. Nothing in his movement rushed or aggressive. He wasn't chasing dominance. He was delivering discipline. Gene gasped on all fours, trembling, sweat pouring now, not from exertion but from realization. This wasn't a bad round. This was a reckoning. He was losing. Not because Chuck was stronger, but because Chuck wasn't trying to win. He was simply correcting a lie. Gene forced himself to stand again. No more words. He was done performing. His body moved now on survival instinct. No rhythm, no flow, just muscle memory and panic. He launched one last spinning heel kick, full force, a desperate Hail Mary. Chuck ducked like brushing past a curtain, then he stepped inside and hooked Gene's leg midair. This time Chuck didn't throw him. He let Gene try to regain balance, let him panic, then reached forward, grabbed the back of Gene's dobok again, and hauled him upright. And then came the final note, an upward elbow, driven cleanly into the underside of Gene Q's jaw. The crack was clinical. Gene's body went limp before it hit the ground. He collapsed like scaffolding giving way, knees folding, head snapping back, arms outstretched and useless. His belt slipped off entirely, landing beside him in a soft heap. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the children in the front row didn't cry. They just watched. Chuck stood over the fallen fighter, breathing deep but steady, not triumphant, not gloating, just centered, grounded. Then he looked down. And for the first time, Chuck Norris looked tired, not physically, spiritually. He looked at Gene Q and said softly, "The mat doesn't care who you insult, but it always tells the truth." Then he turned and walked away. No spotlight followed, no music played, just the echo of his boots on canvas and the sound of truth settling into a stunned room. Behind him, Gene Q's body remained still. One hand twitched once, reflex, not will. His eyes were glassy. His jaw hung just slightly open, and across his face was written the one thing he'd never prepared for: humility. The mat faded behind him. Chuck Norris walked to the corridor backstage, hoodie pulled over his shoulders, hands relaxed at his sides, breaths slow and even. Fluorescent lights buzzed softly above, flickering across beige lockers and scuffed tile floors. His footsteps echoed in the quiet. No claps, no cheers. The chaos of the expo hall now felt like another world. Behind him, the air was still thick with silence and the memory of bone hitting canvas. He didn't look back. There was nothing left to say. A few staffers passed him hurriedly, eyes wide, clutching clipboards like lifelines. None dared meet his gaze. One man nearly dropped his headset, then gave a silent bow as Chuck walked by. Further down the hallway, the sound of applause began, soft, polite. Not celebration, not excitement, just respect. Confused, heavy, and cautious from a crowd still trying to process what they'd witnessed. It didn't reach Chuck. He turned a corner, stepping into a quiet space with vending machines and a bench near the locker rooms. The tension hadn't left his shoulders, but his eyes were calm again. The storm had passed. Then he heard a voice behind him, small, nervous, young. "Sir." Chuck stopped. He turned slowly. A teenage boy stood there, no older than 13. His dobok was crisp, perfectly tied. The ends of his white belt were even, his posture stiff. He bowed, low, formal, respectful. Then he straightened, cheeks flushed, hands trembling. "Thank you," the boy said, "for defending what matters." Chuck didn't speak right away. He studied the boy, not his uniform, not his belt, his eyes. The boy didn't flinch. Finally, Chuck spoke. His voice was quiet, measured. "Do you know what I defended out there?" The boy nodded instinctively.